Devon, how might your experience or lessons learned with construction administration help engineers improve their project outcomes? And why is it really critical to the success of aviation projects?
Really, at the start of my job, I was on construction pretty much full time for the first year and a half, 2 years. And I really got a good understanding of the partnership between the airport, the engineer, and the contractor. At the end of the day, everybody wants to get the job done. We want to get it done right. We want everybody to get home safely. Nobody's rooting for the project to fail. I think sometimes we
The one thing that you can do to be successful as a project manager in the architecture, engineering, and construction industry is to plan your projects more effectively. Everything starts with a good foundation. And in today's episode, I'm thrilled to have with me Devon Baummer. Devon is a licensed professional engineer, and he's a civil engineer in aviation at Mead Hunt. And Devon talks about a couple of things that you can do early on in your projects that will make all the difference long term. He also talks about how getting field experience as a PM can really help you to understand the entire life cycle of a project and drive the most value to your projects and your clients. Let's jump right in. All right, now I'd like to welcome our guest onto the show for today. Devon Baummer is a licensed professional engineer. He's also a civil engineer in aviation at Mead Hunt. Devon, welcome to the AEC Project Management Podcast.
As I thanks for having me.
So, Devon, just to get us going here, can you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and how you got to your current role at Mead Hunt?
Yeah, so I'm a like you said, civil engineer, project manager for Mead Hunt in our San Diego office. Been working at Mead Hunt for 7.5 years, ever since I graduated college. Went to school at CU Boulder, University of Colorado, and had a internship in college where I worked at Denver International Airport. Use the word internship kind of loosely. It was testing concrete materials, which at the time was the first time I'd ever worked anything outside of retail, anything over 40 hours in a week. I realized I had to get my grades back together. The following year did a lot better in school. And interestingly, that kind of negative experience turned into a positive because I think when I looked for jobs, the Mead Hunt saw that I'd worked on airports. They hired me out in California. Worked there for a year and a half, moved back to Colorado for the last 5 or 6 years, and then recently moved out to Southern California.
Awesome. And I think every job, counts in some way. And even some of those field jobs when you're younger. I know I did some surveying in school and going through pricker bushes and heavy in the woods. I didn't like it at the time, but it ended up really helping me understand, I guess, site construction and how sites are laid out, which became very, very helpful when I got into civil design. But can you talk about some of the unique challenges that you face when we're talking about managing a project like an airport civil design project?
Yeah, for sure. So airports, it's somewhat similar to working on a road project, but we have a lot more stringent design guidelines. The FAA, Federal Aviation Administration, has advisory circulars that we have to follow the design guidelines from those. So on a road, you can have a pretty significant grade break. Actually, living in San Diego, where we don't have snow plows, we have significant changes in grade where my car bottoms out sometimes. Can't have that in the airport. If the plane bottoms out, that's many millions of dollars down the drain. So that's one of the biggest challenges on design is getting those grades to be flat enough to not impact the planes, but also sloped enough to get drainage so that you don't have anybody hydroplaning out there. And then it's just the back and forth with the airports as well. So never do we just design from preliminary to completion without back and forth. We got to get the airport on board. We got to get the FAA on board. We got to work with the tenants to figure out closures and then make sure it's actually that we design something that's actually constructible at the end of it all.
Interesting. Yeah, I would imagine that there are some things you need really to be aware of, like the grade, for example, which is interesting. Devon, how might your experience or lessons learned with construction administration help engineers improve their project outcomes? And why is it really critical to the success of aviation projects?
Yeah. So really at the start of my job, I was on construction pretty much full time for the first year and a half, 2 years. And I've really got a good understanding of the partnership between the airport, the engineer, and the contractor. At the end of the day, everybody wants to get the job done. We want to get it done right. We want everybody to get home safely. Nobody's rooting for the project to fail. I think sometimes we get in our head that the contractor's trying to skirt corners or do things the wrong way, but they're not trying to do anything wrong. So at the end of the day, it kind of comes down to, from being on site, I realized that we all want to work together. Additionally, there's stuff that you see in the field that you look at the plans and you go, I don't know what somebody was thinking when they wrote that. And those experiences in the field then help you when you get back in the office to say, when I was in the field, we were laying this out and I didn't know how to lay that out in the field because we didn't have enough information. Let's add that to the plans. Then the next time you go on site, you see something that doesn't work, you bring that back to the plans. So every construction job, you learn a little bit more about how the contractor is looking at things, how you can communicate that better on the plans so that you have less RFIs out in the field. And then as far as organization as well, with construction jobs, we do a lot of weekly meetings. So every week we go through what's the status of the project, where are we going next, who's doing what, who's responsible for this and that helps to organize back in the office as well for when we're actually running through designs.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And the reason that I asked, this is a project management podcast. And the reason I asked Devon that is because I think if you want to be a really great project manager, you really need to understand the entire life cycle of the project all the way through, in Devon's case, construction of the airport or the runway or whatever he's working on in that specific project. If you're a mechanical engineer designing components of an airplane, if you had the ability to go in and see that aircraft being built and then go back to the design drawing board, it would unlock, I think, a lot of more understanding for you, especially as a project manager, right? I was a civil engineer designing subdivisions and residential communities. So for me, being a surveyor when I was in high school or college in the summers, being out in the field and seeing them build these developments really helped me to become a better designer, better project manager. So I think whatever field you're managing projects in, the more field experience you can get, the more ability to see that end product being built or constructed or manufactured is only going to help you as a project manager to be more successful, to run the project and keep your projects on schedule and on budget, because you know all of the stakeholders, all of the potential problems that could arise during the execution of that project. So, Devon, bringing this back to kind of the projects you work on, can you talk to us about the process of securing grant funding for aviation projects and why it's really important for a PM in your industry to understand that?
Yeah. So basically every project that we work on, all the airports that we work with are publicly owned, publicly funded. So typically speaking, in a general year, the FAA will fund 90%, roughly 90% of the project costs. With that in mind, we got to make sure the FAA is on board with what we want to do. So every airport has a capital improvement plan. So 5 years down the road, these are the projects we want to do. 20 years down the road, this is where we want to go. We got to get the airport aligned with the FAA to make sure the airport's plans match with what the FAA or the FAA approves of the airport's plans and that they have the funding available. There's not just an unlimited pot of money. We need to make sure that we're planning for when funds are available. We have projects ready for those. And talking about before, you'd mentioned the kind of project life cycle. At the end of every project, we have to submit closeout documentation to the FAA to prove that things were done correctly. And going back to that collaborative piece with the contractor, we have to be able to prove we pay them for what they do on site. So we have to be able to prove that everything they did was per the spec, per the requirements, so that they can actually get paid for their work. And just making sure that we can basically survive an audit with the FAA is crucial for our work out there.
Yeah, and I think Devon's answer to that question really highlights something that is maybe one of the most important things in project management, which is you need to deliver maximum value to your clients and your stakeholders on your project. And what Devon described on his project in aviation with airports is they've got funding, they've got to use it by a certain period of time. So if you want to be the best PM, the best consultant, the best project manager you can be for that client, you got to help them use the funds appropriately. So you have to understand their project portfolio, what that schedule looks like, and be able to match up the right projects with the right funds. And so I think that applies to any project you're working on. Again, we're getting some great aviation examples here. I'll give you an example from EMI, where we do training, we do big project management development programs for public and private sector. We're working with a big public agency to train a lot of their project managers. And what's interesting is with the schedule, we really need to be sensitive to doing the training for the design professionals at a certain point of the year, and then doing the design for the construction professionals maybe in the winter, because they're not in the field as much as they would be during the other months. So again, it doesn't matter what project you're running, aviation, learning and development program, you need to understand how it's going to work best for your clients, for the stakeholders, and try to serve them that value. I think that's what a really good project manager does. I hope you can take that away from some of the stuff we're talking through today. So, Devon, how do you approach internal and external communications on these large scale projects? What strategies have worked well for you?
Yeah, I think just being proactive, talking with the team early and often, setting expectations. So at the start of every project, have a kickoff meeting with the team, kind of go through, all right, I'm the project manager. I'm making sure have tasks ready for them so that when they're available, they can work on those tasks, making sure other people understand other people on the internal team understand what their tasks are, and then working externally with the airport to figure out, we're going to give you this is our proposal we'll tell you where we're at 30%, 60%, 90%, and we'll have weekly meetings or bi-weekly meetings, however often the airport wants to communicate. So they're not surprised when we get into those review meetings. We're talking constantly enough or frequently enough that we're all on the same page as we go through the design, approaching them with questions, getting their feedback. So it's an iterative process together.
That's great. And two things I want to highlight from Devon's answer. The first one is kickoff meeting. We work with a lot of AEC organizations, again, doing project management training. And usually the low hanging fruit in these organizations to improve their PM efforts is to do a kickoff meeting. You'd be surprised about how many companies or PMs in these firms or organizations do not do kickoff meetings, or they do a poor kickoff meeting. And to me, the kickoff meeting is your opportunity to initiate the project the right way, communicate the plan, get everybody on the same page from day one, and set up how your process is going to flow, how your project is going to flow. So I think that that's a real critical thing that we can all do a better job of, most likely as PMs. And I would kind of challenge the listeners to do that, just because I think it's so important to set that course the right way. And I think the other thing that Devon said that's important that I think clients want is no surprises. Right? Devon mentioned if you're communicating constantly with them, you're communicating regularly, you've got a good cadence, you've got good meetings, there's not going to be any surprises. And if something comes up, you're going to have the avenue to communicate it with them quickly and efficiently so that they know, they're aware of it. You can make a decision if you need to, and you move on to the next thing. And so, again, just a couple of big takeaways. If you can create a great kickoff meeting and you can make sure that your clients are informed, or the project stakeholders are informed, and there's no surprises, I think you're going to be successful as a PM. Those are two really, really important things. So, Devon, what are some key lessons that you've learned working in the commercial and general aviation airports across different geographic regions, different states, different counties? Talk about that.
Yeah. So like I said earlier, when I started in Northern California, moved to Colorado, to Denver, and now I'm in Southern California. And I've had kind of a wide variety of projects between small general aviation airports, where you've got this biggest thing you've got is maybe a 4 or 5 seat airplane, up to regional commercial airports. So not the big ones, but somewhere in between. Each region is run by an airport's district office, or ADO, and every ADO treats things a little bit differently. Spending the last 5 or 6 years in the Rocky Mountains, I was working on projects in Colorado and Utah. That ADO, they have kind of the same processes across the region. Moving back to California, I'm learning all sorts of new stuff about how differently California runs things. Not saying it's a good thing or a bad thing, just different. And it's been a learning process that is definitely something new for me. And then at the airport level itself, just knowing how different construction and operations impact airports differently. So if you've got that small commercial aviation, or you've got that small general aviation airport, shutting down the runway might not be a big deal. You get some pilots that are mad for a week. It doesn't really impact them that much. You get a commercial aviation airport, you get commercial flights coming in, you shut something down, you shut runway down for a week, that's canceled commercial flights. That's much broader impact. And depending on the airport, depending on the stakeholders, you have to plan out this project will impact this airport this way versus this one will impact that one that way. Some jobs we might have to close the runway at night to do the work because we can't do it while flights are coming in. Others, they might not care if the runway is closed. So communicating with the airport, communicating with their stakeholders to know how projects will impact them and how important it is that they maintain our operations is critical. And then also just dealing with different clients too, different airport directors, airport managers, whoever you're working with, at different levels of interest in projects, whether they want to be involved in every single submittal, whether they want to be involved with every single design step, or they just want the big picture. Kind of getting to know your client, getting to understand what level of interest they have in the project, what level of involvement they want to have is pretty critical so that they're either not, they don't feel like they're outside of the team, or they don't feel like they're getting inundated with too much information.
Yeah, and again, this speaks to the importance of the planning process group in project management, right? When you know you're going to have a project, you know the location it's going to be, or you have multiple projects or multiple sites in different regions, part of your planning process as a project manager needs to be to understand maybe the different regulations or codes or requirements or desires of those different districts or locations. I think that's a really important part of project management. And that's one of the reasons that we need to spend time on planning our project, maybe creating a PMP, project management plan that can be reviewed in the kickoff meeting again, like we talked about earlier. So again, it's another curveball that can get thrown to us as PMs when you have the same client, but they're operating in different locations. Doesn't mean that the project's going to be exactly the same. And as a PM, you really need to be aware of that. All right, Devin, I want to switch gears a little bit here. And I know you've worked with an organization called Engineers in Action. Can you talk about what that is, your experience, and how it's kind of shaped your perspective as a civil engineer?
Yeah, so in college, everybody was joining clubs. A lot of my friends went and worked with Engineers Without Borders. I joined this club that was similar concept, Bridges to Prosperity. That was essentially Engineers Without Borders works on water projects. Bridges to Prosperity worked on pedestrian footbridges in rural communities. So that college program used to be Bridges to Prosperity. They merged with Engineers in Action. That college program moved over to Engineers in Action. I might be saying this wrong, but essentially that club would now be Engineers in Action. So when I was in college, I worked with them on pedestrian footbridges in rural Bolivia. Essentially, the group gets requests from regions within Bolivia that during the dry season, they might be able to cross a river just fine. But when the rains come, you got deadly river crossings that communities are trying to find a way to be able to get to markets, get to healthcare, get to school, whatever it is that you and I, we just get in a car, we get on a bus, whatever it is, they are completely cut off from what they need to get to during the wet season. So in college, I worked with that team as a quote unquote project manager to go down to Bolivia to help out with the project. Basically, when we did the design, it was super straightforward. Everybody had signed off on the land. Really easy project. It was going to be great. First day we get down there, one of the landowners didn't understand how much land it was going to take from his property. And essentially the project got nixed. And then we're in rural Bolivia, middle of nowhere. Got plans to be down there for 2 or 3 months and got 8 or 10 college kids not really sure what we're going to do. So while we're down there, we helped survey a bunch of different sites. And we wound up having a different project that we were able to work on for a month and a half. This community was a lot more supportive. Unfortunately, it was a much more challenging bridge to design. The one side was all dirt. The other side, however, was fractured shale. So we weren't allowed to use dynamite. You don't have any equipment. So essentially, you're trying to clear a rock face of shale with a pickaxe and wheelbarrows. So you pick at it for an hour, you get a handful of shale, put it in a wheelbarrow, carry it down a hill, and repeat for 2 months. So unfortunately, on that project, we weren't able to finish it that year. The following year, the college sent down a team that was able to finish that out. But then while at Mead Hunt, I was able to travel as a mentor early in my career to help one of these projects in the Kingdom of Eswatini, formerly known as Swaziland. And that project, I got to go in right at the end. So they were hanging the cables for the bridge. The community pouring the foundations for the bridge, the approaches. The community was extremely cooperative on that project. They had probably 20 or 30 people on site every single day.
Wow.
Engineers in Action had local masons that we were helping get trained on design of the project, and they're the ones kind of leading the construction. And ultimately, the goal of every development organization is that ultimately their role on the project won't be there anymore. And I think the biggest success we saw with Engineers in Action was during COVID, the masons were able to do their own projects. When people from the U.S. couldn't travel, the masons were able to, I can't recall if they designed it, but they definitely implemented the design without input from without people traveling from the U.S. So that was a great experience of getting to see a project that actually made a huge difference in a community. The bridge that we worked on, particularly in the Eswatini, I believe a few girls had died trying to cross the river a few years previously. So to be able to provide a safe crossing, and on the final day, there was probably 200 kids came down and crossed the bridge. And for first, they're really tentative. The bridge does move up and down a bit. It is a suspended bridge after all. But once they got on it and started not being afraid, it was extremely exciting for everybody in the community. They threw a big celebration. I don't think you can really beat that experience. It was something else.
So you actually did the design and you built the bridges as well.
Yeah. So Engineers in Action has, at least at the time, there was a stamping engineer in the U.S. or an engineer in charge. They have extremely conservative designs. So on the mentorship side, we knew the factors of safety. So if we have a tolerance for the design or tolerance for construction, if it's off by a little bit, you still have this level of factor of safety. So you're able to have a relatively standard design that the college teams can then work on in Civil 3D to put together the plans. And then when they're in construction, they have different project controls. The mentors can kind of tell them this would be safe, this wouldn't be safe. And that's all based on an extremely well-researched high factor of safety design, because we don't have concrete testers down there doing slump tests. We don't have concrete trucks mixing concrete. We got bunch of bags of cement, some water, and some rock. You mix on the ground, looks like concrete. Can't ever really confirm how strong or anything like that. But yeah, it's a pretty great experience, and would recommend to anybody that has the time and means to do it.
That's great. That's great. All right. So I guess the last question in this segment that I'll ask, and then we'll go to our PM Pitfall segment, is just based on your experience both at Mead Hunt, your experience at Engineers in Action, just working as a project manager in the architecture, engineering, construction industry, what would you say are some of the key skills that you feel PMs need to be successful as a project manager?
Yeah, I think probably the biggest ones are proactiveness, being on top, getting ahead of things before they happen, communicating constantly, knowing who to communicate with, how you prefer to communicate with them, setting expectations of how often you're communicating, and then being able to collaborate with people. One of the biggest pitfalls I see us as PMs having is we've all, for the most part at least, most PMs have done the work that then they're asking other people to do. We know we can get in CAD, we can get in whatever the project is and knock it out pretty quickly, but then you're never giving growth to other people. You're never growing yourself as a project manager. So understanding how to teach other people the steps to get a project done and understanding how to collaborate with them so you don't have to do everything, I think is probably the biggest strength to develop as a PM.
Yeah, that's great. Again, a lot of what Devon said there goes back to proper project planning, because when you do your planning process, you can put together a communication plan and you understand who are the stakeholders you need to communicate, how often, what channels you're going to be communicating with. And that can, again, make sure that there are no surprises, right? That things get done on time and that you can foster collaboration through these different outlets. So again, a lot of what we've talked about today really leans on the importance of setting up a project right from the beginning in terms of initiating and planning your project and kicking it off properly and having those communication channels in place. But it was nice to hear Devon talk about it both in the way of his job at Mead Hunt, but also some of the volunteer work that he's done through Engineers in Action. So what we're going to do now is we'll take a quick break and we'll come back and we'll wrap up with our PM Pitfall segment. We'll be right back. All right, so we're going to wrap up with Devon now. And Devon, to wrap us up in this pitfall segment, we usually ask the following. What's the biggest PM pitfall that you've seen, and how would you recommend that a PM can overcome it or avoid it altogether for those PMs listening?
Yeah. So I'm a relatively new to the project management side. I've been doing it for the last 3 years or so. And if you'd asked me this a few months ago, my answer would probably be different from today. If you ask me a year from now, it might be different from today as well. Right now, my biggest answer probably would be planning or understanding the tasks before you give them to people. You can always reach out to somebody and say, I need this done by this date. But if you don't understand and plan out every single step to get to that point, then you can't, how can you expect somebody else to do that work if you can't tell them to get from A to Z, you need to do complete letters B through Y. If you just tell them you need to get from A to Z and don't give a framework of this is where we're starting, this is where we're getting, these are the steps we need to do to get there, then you're setting them up. You might be setting them up for failure if they don't understand the tasks to get across that.
That's great. And I think that that's a big challenge for project managers because really a lot of PMs are either technical professionals, whether you're an engineer, an architect, right? You've been doing a lot of the technical work. Then you get to project management. Now you're juggling all these different balls, all these stakeholders, you're managing a team, and you may not be used to that kind of communication on that level where you're delegating, you're telling people the steps or the expectations of what you need. And again, that's a recipe for disaster, right? If you're asking someone to do something, but you're not clear what you expect at the end, how can they be clear on what to deliver? So I think it's a real important point. And I'm glad that Devon kind of focused on that one for our pitfall. Well, Devon, listen, you've given us some really good information here about what you've accomplished so far and some of the experience you've had in your career. I think it's going to be a big help to our listeners who are PMs. Thank you so much for spending some time with us here on the AEC PM podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Devon. He is a really bright guy, and he gave tips that really can be used to set your project up from the beginning, which I would say a lot of PMs in AEC industry do not do. So make those little changes and you will be successful as a PM. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to our channel here. We put out videos like this on a weekly basis to help engineers become better managers and leaders. I'll see you next week.